I'm Pamela Schultz, and thank you for joining today. We're going to be talking about the layout settings within DataGraph, and in particular, focusing on the graphs or the files, the examples that are within the layout section of the online examples. So if you've been attending all along this month, you know we've gone through basic graphs. We've talked about graphs for analysis last week. And yeah, today we're going to be talking about the layout within DataGraph, which I think is one of the things to really master, to really understand how to get the most out of the program in terms of being able to take basic graphs and have a pipeline within DataGraph that lets you go from your graphs to your final graphic that's going to go in your publication or your presentation. So the layout settings do a lot of really cool things. And again, it's important to really understand them to use the program. So let me go ahead and share my screen and we will get started. Here we go. So here we see the online examples. And again, the one that we're focusing on right now in DataGraph 5.0 is this section on layout. And when you go in here, I think you can see right away how this is a little bit different from some of the other sections, in that in particular, you see a lot of these panel graphs, scatter plot matrix. And again, this is, you know, there's a lot of different examples in here. Some of these I've been realizing maybe are more appropriate for custom, we're trying to make sure these categories all make sense with the different types of graphs that we have. But what I wanted to do was actually start with one of the things that I think is maybe one of the first things to learn once you start making graphs within the program, which is this file here within layout, which is just simply called graph size. So I'm going to go ahead and open up that file. And as I said, we've been updating these, adding new figures, trying to add more description of what's in the graphs. And this one is a relatively simple file, but again, it's such an important thing to know that you can do, because if I start from scratch and I make a basic graph, this is a file that just has a simple X and Y column. So I'll go ahead and this is a lot of what we talked about in the first webinar this month, was just going ahead and creating a simple plot of our data. But the graph here, the size is going to change with my scale. For those of you who are existing users, you're probably very familiar with this, but let me go ahead and just describe this briefly. So you notice when I change this, there's a numbers in the center of the screen. These are showing you the pixel size of the graph, depending on how you change the sliding windows. But if I go over to here, you'll see there is a size menu and it's set to automatic. I can change this to specified. And right away, something happened, right? The size of my graph has changed here. So what happened? Well, when I change it to specified, there's now an entry box where you can enter the exact size of the graph that you want to use. So here it by default just does 5 inches by 3 inches. You don't have to use inches, you can use centimeters. So there's an example here where it shows the same graph in 20 centimeters by 10 centimeters. So you can type in the units of measure. You can also use pixels. Here it's just 600 by 400. So the other thing I guess that's important to recognize here is when I changed the graph size, you notice how it changed obviously the aspect ratio to be based on that size, but there's also a zoom setting for the graph. And that is here just to the right of the graph size. So when you're working with the file, if you want to zoom in on a section, you can make this much larger. If you set this though to actual, then it gives you the actual size that the file of the graph will be if you print this out, which is a really useful thing to be aware of. So anyway, I know you guys who've been around for a while, this is probably all really familiar to you, but it is such a key thing. I just wanted to sort of start off with this, and notice how in this file there is a link to how to specify the size of a graph. This goes onto the online help. So we're trying to do that as well, to add more links that bring you into articles that are going to go into more detail about how to do these customizations. Okay, so that's all I wanted to do on that file. Let's go ahead and move on to the one here that's actually at the bottom of this section. This is a histogram on a separate axis. And this one I thought would be nice to start with, just because last week also we talked a lot about histograms. And this, again, sticking with some of the things that I think really highlight some of the power of DataGraph, is the ability to create a graphic like this is very, very easy, where you can see I have my points that are here, and then this histogram is just a really easy thing for me to do within DataGraph. So let me walk you through this. And here is just what this looks like, kind of the default settings that you get when you create this. So let's start. Let's make a new graph, and we can highlight our X and Y columns, go ahead and do points. I have my hover turned on. For those of you who don't know what that is, you can do that under View and either show or hide hover information. You can also see there's a shortcuts here. Shift Command H will also toggle this on and off. That's why you see the X and Y in the row there. Anyway, so I quickly created this points, and now I want a histogram of the Y data set. To do that, so we talked about this last week. I just hit that one column. I can go into the draw menu and click histogram. So what happened? Well, this clearly isn't how we would want to plot this, because we have the histogram on the same axis as my data. So what I'm doing here is I'm actually creating what we call a split axis. And this is also on what we call it canvas settings. You see a button for split X and split Y. I can split the X axis. And when I do, every command will then have a visual indicator of what axis it's located on. So I'm going to move my histogram by just clicking this box over to the right axis. You can see it's very easy to move these all between the different axes. But what I want to do with this histogram is have it along the Y axis instead of here where it's shown on the X axis. So it's using the Y data, but I want it to look like that. So there's a menu here for along, where you can flip which axis the histogram is drawn on. This gives me my histogram. And the last thing that I did here to customize this is, well, there are a couple of things, I guess. One is just to draw a box around each. You can see in this one that there's a box style drawn around each one. And actually, I think I'll turn off my hover for a moment now. And to do that, actually, there's two ways that you can do this. One way is that you go into the style settings themselves and change where the box style is to axis box. That will draw the axis, but there's a shortcut to get that setting. You can right click on the graph itself, and you can directly change the box style there. Okay, and the last thing here is changing. You notice on this final graph how the points are taking up a lot more space than the histogram in terms of the x-axis itself. This is easy to change. It's actually a setting called width within this extra axis or split axis that I created. And the width setting, when it's set to 1, it simply means that the space for the histogram is 100% of what's available to it. If I scale this down, then it's going to shrink it down. And it also then gives more space to the points. So you have, a lot of flexibility in how you change that using that width setting. So a good question on the chat is, can you flip the histogram to show it as horizontal instead of vertical? And you absolutely can do that. Actually, what I think is a common way to do these graphs is actually to have one on each axis. I've seen that before. So if you wanted to just take this one and have it, for example, use the X data, put it back on the X axis, but now we want to split it in the Y direction, not the X direction. So I'm going to change this to add a split in the, oops, that's not what I wanted, and add a split in the Y. Now I have these 4 different boxes that I can allocate things to. So I'll move this over here. And this maybe looks a little strange because it's a very uniform set of data within the X direction as indicated by the histogram. I could get rid of this Y axis if I didn't need this anymore. And you literally just highlight this object and hit the delete key. And oops, let me undo that. I meant the X one. There we go. So now I have it on the top of my data. And if I wanted to bring that back, again, just to kind of really see here how there we go. I could take this histogram, option drag to make a clone, put this on my Y-axis, have this be the Y data, and put this here. And now you see how you get this kind of foundation for this type of graph where we can, again, make each one of these maybe a little bit smaller. On the right-hand side too, so you can have a graph that looks like this. I feel like there's a specific name for this type of graph where you have the histograms on both sides, but I can't think of that off the top of my head. If anyone knows what it is, feel free to put that on the chat. And the next one here is a basic panel graph. A panel graph is where we have these multiple panels or panes where we have something drawn. And this is also going to use this split axis functionality of DataGraph. There was a whole webinar we did on panel graphs that you can find on our YouTube channel if you want to really, get into the nitty gritty of this. But here's the graphic that's the title here saying before the split. This is before we split the data. And actually, maybe it would be good to have the line colors here too, just so you can kind of see which line is which. Another thing that actually I did in this file, if you look at the version of the 4x4, is I set up a slider variable here on the left-hand side, because whenever you have multiple commands where, for example, you could go in here and change the line width individually, but if you want to change all 4 of these, then you want to go back, maybe you want to change it again, that can be a little bit of a pain. So I often set up my own little slider variable here. So we could go ahead and show you, here's all 4 lines when I just create this with these 4 different data sets. And then when I split the graph, I do, again, both the split X and the split Y. And now for each one of my lines, I can see where that line is located and kind of place these within the graph itself. So the last thing I think that I wanted to show you with this file is how you can change the space in between these panels. So every one of these little settings you have control over, and that is also something that you change within these objects that represent these split axes. So if I open this up, you'll see that this is the X axis, and it has a space on left. So that's actually controlling this distance right here. I just set it to none, but you can set it to all these different things. You can set it to exactly something. So you can, there's a slider that you can change that or type in a pixel space. This even takes actual units of measure. So I could say that I want 1 inch in between these two panels, or 1 centimeter in between these two. And when it prints, you'll have exactly 1 centimeter between them. And again, in this example, I was just showing this with none. When you go into a split y-axis, then it, instead of saying space on the left of the axis, it says space below. And you can change that again also to none if you want this look where you have these panels without a margin in between them. All right, let's go on to another file and look at this one, panel graph with axes. So the big difference here is this is a file where you see now how every graph shows the X and Y axes. In fact, for cases where you're plotting data where you want to compare the data between different axes, it is often the preferred style to not show the axis. I believe Science Magazine, for example, that's what they recommend when you're doing a split axis like that or panel graph like that. But there are cases where you may want to show the axes on each one, or you may have very different ranges, so you have actual different graphs for them. So in this file, we have actually a group of graphs that were made independent of one another and then combined into this one image that you see here. Up in the thumbnails, you'll see how there's this graph group that if you click the top left corner of that, it will expand out so you can see each one of these individual graphs. Notice that these all have a size specified. So these are all set to 4 inches by 2 inches. So they'll have a consistent size between them. Can go ahead and actually let me show you how did I pull these together. So to make a graphic like this where you're combining multiple, you're using a command called a graphic command. And to do this, really what I guess there's a couple of things. One thing is that when we make a graph by default, you can see how there is always a, there's the box around this with the X and Y axes, that if I put any data here, you'll see the tick marks in the axis range. Just delete that. But what if you want to combine graphs from together to composite them? You don't want to see this line around the edges, and there's a way to not show them. There's actually tick marks right here for draw X and Y numbers that you can just uncheck. That's one aspect of it, where if there was an axis there, it wouldn't show them. Actually, maybe I'll bring back that single point on this graph just so you can really see what's happening here. And let's make the font bigger. So yeah, either of those can be hidden. And then the other part of this, if I go ahead now and delete that data from that point, is to not show the box. So we talked about the box style earlier, and we said how you can access it by right-clicking on the canvas. And if you change the box style to axis box here, actually that did not get rid of it. Let me double check here. How do I? Oh, there it is. It's only axis. Oh, I should have just continue trying those. Okay, so if you change the box style to only axis, then it's not it isn't drawing anything. So again, maybe it makes more sense when you also see data being drawn, because when it's only axis, it's only drawing a box around the X and Y axis tick marks where those are located. So if I then hide those, now you don't see anything, and I'll delete this data. So what do I have here? Well, I have a nice blank canvas that I can use to composite my other graphs. And I do that, as I said, with a command called a graphic command. So let's go ahead and add one of those. And the graphic command allows you to add images. So it doesn't have to be a graph within your DataGraph file. You can add in other images into here, but I'm going to choose a graph, and there it is. So you see now how there is a graphic within my canvas. Now I can't edit this here. It's almost like a screenshot within the program, but I can go ahead and size this graph. I probably want this to be much bigger than the individual graphs would be. And what you see here is this is anchored into the upper right corner. So if I want to add more of these, I could take this graphic command, option drag it, and within I get this thumbnail view here. I can pick another graphic, and I can have this one be in the upper left. Another handy thing that I've shown many times before, but I love doing this, is that you can actually click and drag a thumbnail and just drop it right into your command list. Now I have that thumbnail here. I can have this one be the lower left, and I can do this one now for the purple one here, and have this one be the lower right. And then there's offsets for each of these that you can set, that if I make these consistent with one another, you can get a, oops, not like that. There we go. You can get a nice, looking final product where everything is just aligned perfectly. So here I'm going to set all my offsets to 0, 0, actually. So everything is just offset in the same way. I would need to make my graph a little bit wider right now to accommodate the graphs as I have them set up. But there you go. So everything is aligned perfectly. And if I change, any of my data or add new data, I don't have to do this again. I'm changing my individual graph, and my composited final figure will also update with everything I have. One thing just to be aware of, this is a common question that I've had people ask about creating insets. So there's a Magnify command, which I'd like to show you an example of that. But in case we don't have an opportunity to do this on another file, let me show you how to do an inset right here within this data. So if I plotted, I don't know, let me just pick any one of these data sets. So say I do a plot of the data that you see here. So here's my graph. Let's go ahead and go ahead and size this. The font here is pretty big, so I probably wouldn't want it quite that big. But if I want to have an inset of another one of these graphs I've created within this figure, you can combine these two approaches. I can scale this down and then place this image here within this graph. Now, in this case, what I'm noticing is I have grid lines that are kind of showing through. So this has what's called an alpha channel. It's transparent. If you wanted it to not be transparent, we could go in here into the canvas settings and set a background for this. So now, I don't know how easy this is for you guys to see, but now I have grid lines within where the image is, but they're not overlaying the image that you see there. They're two separate graphs. Now, if you don't want grid lines at all, actually the default currently within DataGraph is to not show grid lines when you create a graph by default, but some of these older files still have them in here. It's easy to get rid of grid lines or add them or change them. This is another thing that you can access directly from on the graph by right-clicking. You'll see there's a grid lines as well as minor grid lines. These are typically set to none, but the grid lines here, we could go ahead and just set that to none. I think that looks cleaner. As I said before, the default in the past had always been to add grid lines. Now we've removed that. And I think even when you do create them, they are created as a solid line instead of a line with dashes in them. So there you see an inset with, again, the graphic command here that's actually pulling in an image we created within this file itself. Let me see here. This is kind of a cool one, actually using a function. So here's a graph that has an inset using the Magnify command. Let's open this one up and look at this one a little bit. So what is going on here? Well, I have this built-in inset, and this is using, again, what we call this Magnify command. This is so easy to do. I can go ahead and let's make a new graph. Let me plot this data. And then if I wanted an inset that zooms in on a section of this, I can go under the label menu. And right at the bottom here, there's a Magnify. Let's go ahead and add that. And this is very interactive. I can go ahead and drag this to the area I want to magnify. That creates my inset, and I can drag this to increase it. Again, this has this issue here that the grid lines are being shown through. I could just say none here, and then you wouldn't see the grid lines within the inset, or get rid of the grid lines for the whole graph. And I could add then grid lines within my graphic command here. And I just want to see if there's anything else I want to say about. So that's I remember at one point I was told in a figure that I was working on that I had to add an inset, and it was so difficult to actually get it to look right. So I think the Magnify command is an incredibly useful thing to have for when you do want to do something like that. And you see how the inset has even its own X and Y axes here. Let's see, one that I wanted to point out is examples with a double axis. These are, we'll look at this first one here. This is a very another common question that we get, how do you create a double axis? Here's two data sets where they're plotted together, just two drawing commands, and then they're split and placed on different axes. You can see there's instructions here as to showing you how to do this. And then lastly, we change the same menu to join them back together again. And then you get another axis here on the right-hand side. That is, the same as what you saw here, right? This is going from 0 to 25. And now you see that over here on the right-hand side. So very easy to make a graphic like this within DataGraph. And actually, one thing that's sort of cool is that you could, have multiple of these and just make up some data here. So if I had another set of data that I wanted to plot, again, option drag, make a copy, very easy. Let's make this a different set of data, but I want to have this one split now on my y-axis again, and I'll put this on the third axis that you see here. So now I have this additional axis line here. And one thing that you can do is you can, there's ways to kind of change the colors of these using an extra axis command, but you can actually stack up many axis lines within a graph. There's no limit to the number that you can do. I think that's kind of a cool thing to be able to do too. And then I think the last one, and any questions or anything that you guys want to talk about, we can do that. But I wanted to just point out the example here that's also for another sort of a common question that I've gotten in the past is about axis breaks. So if you open up this file, you see how there is this example here with an axis break, and this is set using, it's sort of the same mechanism of these split axis. This is actually using a split axis, but showing different data on each side. So there's a single set of data that if I put on points, you can see how there's a big gap between this data set in terms of the y-axis. So if I split this, and what I actually do here is I option drag, make a copy of this command. So I put the command on both axes, but on the top one, I'm going to zoom in here on these two sets of data. On the bottom one, I can click and drag to zoom in on that set of data. But now I want to indicate that this is a split axis. So I can do that in this same menu I used earlier. I can change it to a break. And now you see it has those double lines there. Hopefully that's something that you can see through the video, but you can check this out with the file. And this one actually also has kind of an interesting template here. If you want the break to be at the same location on both, but you're just changing the scales, then that's something that you can do as well. So this template shows you how to do that. Okay, so question, can you set the axis numbers and labels to the appropriate color? So let's go ahead and look at this on this file that you see here. If I want to change these axis labels, and I'm assuming this is the one that you mean, the file that I had the split axis on, to change these colors, this actually is something that I think we could probably make slightly easier for you, because right now the way that you have to do this is actually to use an extra axis command. Okay, great. Yeah, I got the right graph. So if you go into the label menu and look at extra axis, this is a command that gives you more flexibility than the standard axis. You can also convert units with this. Another very handy command to just be aware of for a variety of things. But you notice when I create this, so it has this icon here, a couple of things that you can change out which axis it is on. And by default, it's always going to show on the inside, just so you know it's there. But if I want this to be positioned to the right, for example, and to show data from a different y-axis. So right now it's the first one I created, but there's all these other y-axes. And you notice how when I check the second one, it's overlaying then when I split the y-axis, the second y is shown here on the right. So on each of these, I can hide my y numbers. This is another way to sort of know what you're doing. So I can hide these the default axis as it's shown, add this in with my extra axis, and this gives you the flexibility to just customize the axis in a lot of different ways. And one of the things you can do is you can change the colors of both the lettering, if you wanted to do that, and the color of the axis itself. So now you can see here how this is a blue axis to match my axis label. And the way that these labels are set up here is really to work well when you have multiple of these stacked. So now that I've created one of these, and this is a command, so it doesn't have to be up at the top. I can drag this to the bottom. I can have as many of these as I want. So let me actually just split this and show you that I can take this, option drag it. I can put another one here to the top, oops, and just move this further over. Again, change the color now to match that green line. So here, you don't really need this label. You could actually just delete it, double click and delete that token. So here's, I do need to change this. There we go. That could be Y3. Now, if you wanted actually all three of the axes to be to the right-hand side, so you don't even have this, the default Y shown, I can hide that as well. And then I can add, again, I like to option drag to make copies. I'll add a second, or really, this is a third Y axis. This is going to use line color 1. And now for all three of these, I want to position them so that they are all staggered. So now you see how I have the first one, the second one, the third one. If you're ever confused about which one is which, you can always just hide, use the hide or exclude button to kind of just confirm which one is this one. But again, you can see the axis indicators here. Oh, and in fact, looks like I have this one. This should really be this data. So this is also very helpful. So you can see this starts with, this is the first y-axis, the one that I stacked above that one, and then the third y-axis here. So now I have my data and my axes are all aligned with one another. Actually, the labels that are here can be directly coming from whatever the name of the column is. So I can make this a token for these. And then this is really sort of the most flexible way to do this, because then if I change my data and I change my, again, add this as a token for my Y3 data. So here I have a template that I could change, what this is called. If I want this to be Y_1 and Y_2, I can do that. And my labels will go ahead and everything updates. If I change any of my data, we can just add in some new data here. Oh, there's no Y. So all of this now becomes a much more flexible template. In fact, as I'm doing this, I think I will upload a file that uses this that creates that has a template just like this, so that if you are making a graph like this, you can you don't necessarily have to start from scratch. You can use the one that I upload. So anyway, so that's one of the ways that the extra axis command is useful. I guess the other thing that I think is very handy that I'll show you, actually, let me just clone the version of the graph here. Now, if this were me too, well, we don't really need this comment here anymore. I'd probably, with this many commands, I'd probably start to group them just to help me kind of keep track of this and make it a little easier to navigate. So here's my lines. But for the extra access command, one of the other things that it allows you to do is to change the units of the data as it's plotted without having to actually perform any calculations within the data table itself. So if I go into, for example, this Y3, you see how there's this units menu. Currently, it's just the same, but I can change this to, if I'm using temperature, there's actually a built-in units conversion directly for temperature where you can say, you know, my temperature's in Kelvin, but I want to display it in Celsius or Fahrenheit. So that's kind of handy just to have that in there. But if you are using standard units of measure, we have a pretty extensive list of units that are already coded into DataGraph. So if my data's in feet, but I want it to display in meters, then I can go ahead and just type in that conversion and it will change the data for me. I'm trying to think of other, I don't know, inches. You know, we can just change. I hate to keep using English units. Maybe centimeter. Maybe I'm going from feet to centimeters. Anyway, so that's I have found that to be very useful. So again, you don't have to necessarily, first of all, remember what the units conversion are, and you don't have to do the calculation within the data table itself, which is often the way that I know I would always do conversions like that in the past. It actually can be handy even if you don't have multiple sets of data. Let's say you have just, as long as I'm sort of on this topic a little bit, let's say you have just a single set of data that you want to draw. But, well, we'll just go ahead and select an X and the Y, but you want this displayed in multiple units. Then that's one of the other things that it's very handy for the extra access command. So I could hide the default Y numbers and add several extra axes commands. We could put them all on the Y-axis or the X-axis. It can work for either. But if I put them all on the Y-axis and again, sort of stagger them, let's position them to the right. I think that sort of looks nice for this type of graph. So I can stagger these just like before. And, oops, okay, this one I don't have to the right. There we go. And then do units conversion. So say my first one, I'm not going to change. Maybe I'm happy with that. But the second one is something I want to, go from centimeters to meters. And maybe I want to, I don't know, go from centimeters to, again, just kind of throwing out 2 inches. And then these I could label with whatever units of measure I have there. And in this case, I need to actually add in, there we go. Actually, this is an important thing we really haven't talked about before we kind of wrap things up, that the margins in the canvas, like here, this label is kind of being cut off a little bit. I don't know how well you can see that. Seems like it should be accommodating that a little bit better, but if I need to add a bigger margin, then I can type in, again, in units of measure within my canvas settings. I could type in that I want 1 centimeter as my margin here to force the distance between the graph and the legend. The axis labels between the top of my graph. Next week, will be the last in this sort of series that we've been doing, going through all these categories, where we're going to talk about the custom graph types and go through a number of the graphs that you see here. These are obviously more complicated than some of the graphs that we've been talking about thus far. Actually, here you see a scatter plot with the histograms on either sides, like we talked about before. But there's just so many different things that you can do. Windrows examples, ternary diagrams, polar plots. There's a bar chart race here, which I think is pretty cool. And also even schematics. This is something created with DataGraph to create kind of an interesting schematic where we put in, what are all the Greek characters and what they look like with different fonts. So again, all done with DataGraph. So thanks everyone for attending, and that's about it. I hope that you have a good weekend, and we will, as always, are happy to answer any questions that you may have.